What if a single broken stone could prove that one of the Bible's greatest kings was real? The summer heat pressed heavily over northern Israel in 1993. The air shimmered above the ruins of Tel Dan, a mound of crumbled stones and forgotten walls lying in the shadow of Mount Hermon. For decades, archaeologists had combed this region, hoping, guessing, sometimes praying, that the earth would give back a fragment of its buried truth. Dr. Avraham Biran, an Israeli archaeologist already in his 80s, had been excavating here for nearly 30 years. He had seen layers of Canaanite, Israelite, and Hellenistic settlements, stones upon stones, history upon history. Yet, on this particular July morning, something different awaited him, something small, unremarkable, and world-changing. It began with a sound, the metallic scrape of a trowel against basalt. A young volunteer brushed away dust, revealing a dark, fractured slab. It was not gold, not a statue, not a treasure, just a broken piece of stone, but across its rough surface ran lines of ancient writing, faint but unmistakable, letters carved by a long-dead hand almost 3 millennia ago. Biran leaned in close. The letters were not Hebrew, not exactly. They belonged to another language, Old Aramaic, used by the kingdoms that warred with ancient Israel. At first, the team assumed it was just another administrative inscription, one of thousands scattered across the Near East. Yet something in those carved lines caught Biran's eye. A word, then another. He brushed again, careful, reverent, and then he saw it, a phrase that would soon ignite debates from Jerusalem to Harvard. BYTDWD, the House of David. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Here, in the dirt of a northern outpost, lay the first extra-biblical reference to King David ever discovered. Until that second, no inscription outside the Bible had mentioned him. To many scholars, David was a legend, a poetic figure born from national myth, but this stone, chipped and half-erased, whispered otherwise. They lifted the fragment gently, as if it were alive. Around them, the Galilean hills held their breath. No trumpets, no divine voices, just the sound of dust sliding off a basalt surface that had slept for 2,800 years. Later, as the sun sank over Tel Dan, the archaeologists gathered around a work table. Under the flicker of a camp lantern, they began tracing each line, translating, cross-referencing. The words began to speak, a tale of war, of kings defeated, of a dynasty remembered by its enemies. The fragments fit together slowly, like pieces of an ancient confession. That night, Biran wrote in his field journal, "Today we found something that might speak louder than any sermon." But at that time, he could not imagine the storm it would unleash, the arguments, the skepticism, the hope. Nor could he know that this small stone would become one of the most important archaeological finds in biblical history, a tangible echo of a man sung about in psalms and worshipped in memory. The Tel Dan inscription would travel from a dusty trench to the headlines of every major newspaper, to the pages of Biblical Archaeology Review, and into countless debates about faith and fact. Yet before any of that, it was just a stone, a silent witness, a piece of basalt that had waited for almost 3 millennia to be heard again. And when it finally spoke, the world listened. The fragment was taken from the earth, cleaned, photographed, and studied under magnifying glass and lamplight. What looked at first like scratches were now revealed as letters, Aramaic, the language once spoken across the lands of ancient Syria and northern Israel. Line by line, the words began to emerge, like a voice rising from centuries of silence. "I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, of the house of David." The translation sent chills through every scholar who read it. Here was a king of Aram Damascus, boasting of his victories over the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, and, in doing so, naming his enemy's dynasty, the House of David. In that era, kings carved their triumphs into stone to make them eternal. These inscriptions were their news bulletins, their propaganda, their monuments of pride. The Tel Dan Stele, as it came to be called, was likely ordered by King Hazael of Damascus, one of Israel's most relentless enemies during the 9th century BCE. Hazael's reign was marked by ambition and blood. The prophet Elisha himself wept when he foresaw what Hazael would do to Israel, burning fortresses, killing young men, ripping open pregnant women. Such was the cruelty of his campaigns that his name became synonymous with fear. And yet, it was this same ruthless man whose victory inscription accidentally preserved the earliest historical reference to David, the shepherd king of Israel. It is a haunting irony that an enemy of God's people would carve into stone the proof of their history. In his arrogance, Hazael had declared, "I crushed the kings of Israel and Judah," but history would remember his boast not as a celebration of conquest, but as confirmation of a king whose name refused to die. The stele itself was written in bold, formal Aramaic script, with each letter deeply incised into black basalt, as if cut by fire. It likely stood upright once, displayed near the city gate of Tel Dan, proclaiming to every passerby that Aram had triumphed. But sometime later, perhaps during a counterattack by Israelite forces, the stele was shattered, its fragments reused in the pavement of a new wall. It was buried, trampled, forgotten, until the summer of 1993, when human hands uncovered what divine providence had preserved. Scholars pieced together several fragments, one found in 1993, two more discovered a year later. Together, they formed a partial but powerful narrative of conquest. Most of the inscription is broken, verbs lost, names missing, yet the three surviving words, House of David, changed everything. For centuries, skeptics had argued that David was a literary invention, a character of national mythology, no more real than King Arthur. The Bible's descriptions of his palace, his wars, his songs, all, they said, were embellishments of later generations. But this fragment, written by Israel's enemies, used the House of David as a political label, not poetry, but a royal designation. Just as the House of Omri referred to a real dynasty of kings in Samaria, so too the House of David implied that there was once a real founder named David whose descendants ruled Judah. The weight of those three words was immense, not only because they proved David's existence probable, but because they placed him firmly within the historical and political world of the ancient Near East. The Bible's world, long dismissed as myth, suddenly touched stone. And beyond the academic excitement, there was something spiritual about it. Imagine a single inscription carved by a pagan king in defiance, yet becoming one of the strongest witnesses to the truth of Scripture. A record of violence turned into a testament of survival. It is said that stones remember what men forget. For centuries, the Tel Dan Stele lay hidden beneath the soil, its sharp edges dulled by time. Yet the moment it was lifted into light, it spoke with astonishing clarity. David had walked this earth. His house had stood. His enemies had known his name. A message written in the ashes of war, now reborn as evidence of faith. The discovery should have been a quiet triumph, a humble confirmation that the Bible's oldest stories were rooted in history. But in the world of academia, nothing so sacred escapes the fire of debate. Within weeks of the Tel Dan Stele's announcement, the find ignited a scholarly battlefield. In one camp were the biblical minimalists, scholars who believed the Old Testament was largely myth, written centuries after the events it described. To them, King David was a symbol, not a sovereign. In the other camp were the maximalists, historians and believers who held that the scriptures reflected real kingdoms, real wars, and real kings whose blood had once stained the earth of Canaan. The phrase House of David struck the heart of that argument like a lightning bolt. To believers, it was divine vindication, proof that faith had left fingerprints in stone. To skeptics, it was a challenge, a riddle to be explained away. Soon, articles flooded journals and newspapers. Some scholars proposed that the inscription had been mistranslated, that BYTDWD might not mean House of David at all, but perhaps referred to a place, a temple, or even an unrelated clan. Others accused the discoverers of wishful thinking, claiming the letters were misread, exaggerated by religious enthusiasm. Dr. Avraham Biran found himself at the center of a storm he never sought. He was a man of science, not ideology, a field archaeologist who trusted the soil more than sermons. Yet suddenly, his find was being claimed by both sides, believers calling it a miracle, critics calling it manipulation. In one televised interview, Biran smiled faintly and said, "The stone says what it says. We only brushed away the dust." But behind that calm voice was exhaustion. Every word of the inscription was being dissected in university halls from Tel Aviv to Chicago. In biblical archaeology, nothing stays academic for long. Every artifact carries a question of faith. The Biblical Archaeology Review published fiery essays. One professor from Copenhagen dismissed the stone as overinterpreted propaganda. Another countered that such denial required more faith than belief itself. Meanwhile, newspapers worldwide ran headlines like, "Stone proves King David was real," "The Bible's greatest king steps out of legend," and, from the skeptic's corner, "Inscription sparks controversy over ancient Israel." Yet beyond the headlines, something quieter was happening. Churchgoers, teachers, and students began looking at their Bibles with new eyes. For generations, faith had been accused of wishful imagination. Now, even a broken stone whispered that the past was not fiction. Still, the debates grew louder. In conferences, scholars projected photographs of the stele on screens, arguing over each letter, each line break, each mark of the chisel. Some said the text was clear, others claimed the letters were damaged beyond certainty. And yet, no one could explain away the power of what was there. Even if fragmentary, even if incomplete, the words House of David stood firm, like the ruins of an old fortress weathering the storms of skepticism. In Israel, the fragment was placed in a glass case at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, where thousands came to see it. Children pressed their faces to the glass. Tour guides spoke softly, as if in a shrine. And in that silence, people felt something more ancient than science, the pulse of continuity. The same David who once sang psalms under the stars now seemed to reach across time, through the voice of an enemy's inscription, saying, "I was here." For Biran and his team, the debates mattered less than the wonder. They had not gone to Tel Dan seeking proof of Scripture. They had gone seeking history. And yet, somehow, they had touched both. Years later, one of his assistants recalled that moment in the dig. "We didn't just find a stone. We found a heartbeat. You could almost feel time breathing." Perhaps that is why archaeology and faith will forever intertwine, because both, at their core, are acts of remembering. Faith remembers what it believes. Archaeology remembers what it can prove. And sometimes, they remember the same thing. As the years passed, the noise of debate quieted, but the stone remained, still cracked, still incomplete, still undeniable. It didn't end the argument, but it changed the question, from "Did David exist?" to "What else have we forgotten beneath the dust?" Even now, decades after its discovery, the Tel Dan Stele rests quietly behind glass, a fragment of basalt no larger than a man's hand, yet heavy enough to tilt the weight of centuries. Visitors lean close, whispering as though afraid to disturb it. The letters, faint and ancient, still glimmer under the museum light. They no longer shout of victory or vengeance. They murmur of something deeper: memory. When the news first broke, many called it proof. But proof is too small a word for what this stone carries. It is not the proof of faith, it is the echo of it. For faith, by nature, does not need evidence. And yet, when evidence appears, carved by an enemy's hand, buried by time, revealed by chance, it feels like the universe itself answering back. I remember. For centuries, King David has stood between history and poetry. To the scholar, he is a figure of political unification, the ruler who forged tribes into a nation. To the believer, he is the psalmist, the man after God's own heart, whose songs still rise in cathedrals and deserts alike. And to the skeptic, he was once nothing more than myth. But a broken stone found in the dirt changed that conversation forever. It is almost poetic justice. A pagan king, Hazael, who once swore to burn Israel to ashes, becomes the unintentional chronicler of Israel's greatest king. His words of conquest outlived his own empire. His monuments crumbled, his gods were forgotten. Yet the 3 words he carved in arrogance, House of David, endure. In that paradox lies a truth that transcends archaeology. The proud record the past, but the humble inherit it. And so, the Tel Dan inscription stands as more than evidence. It stands as a mirror. It reflects how fragile our memory of truth can be, and how fiercely truth refuses to die. From shepherd fields outside Bethlehem to the throne in Jerusalem, from psalms sung in caves to the eternal covenant God swore through David's line, this king's story continues to breathe, in scripture, in history, and now in stone. Every generation must rediscover it, not because faith depends on fragments of rock, but because fragments remind us that faith was always rooted in reality. They remind us that the Bible was not written in clouds, but on the soil of real cities, by real hands, for real hearts. One can almost imagine the final scene, the sun sinking over the hills of Tel Dan, the wind curling through the ruins, the cicadas humming over the dust. The stone lies silent again, but its silence is not emptiness, it is completion. The voices that once fought, wept, prayed, and sang across this land are now part of the earth itself, and when the wind passes over, it seems to carry a whisper: the king lives, the covenant endures. In the end, the Tel Dan Stele is not about archaeology winning a debate. It is about memory breaking through oblivion, about the divine handwriting of history, visible for those who have eyes to see. It tells us that time forgets many names, but never the ones that matter to God. And somewhere beneath the stones of Israel, more echoes still wait to be found, more testimonies waiting for the light. For those who listen, the stone still speaks, not in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, but in a universal language older than both, the language of truth carved in endurance. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Isaiah 48. What if history still hides 1,000 voices waiting to be heard? If one broken stone could speak after 28 centuries, imagine what else still lies beneath the dust, waiting to remind us that faith was never just a story. If this episode moved you, share it. Let more people hear the whisper of truth from the stones of Israel. And if you believe that the past still has something sacred to say, subscribe to the Hidden Gospel for more journeys into the forgotten evidence of faith, archaeology, and divine history. Because every fragment tells a story, and sometimes even the stones cry out,